They reached the basin of Deadman's Pass just as the sun began to bleed a bruised purple across the sky. The silence there was absolute, yet heavy, like a physical weight pressing against their eardrums. As they set up camp beneath the shadow of a jagged limestone overhang, the first anomaly occurred. It wasn't a sound, but a lack of one. The evening wind, which had been whipping through the pines all afternoon, simply stopped. "Do you hear that?" Elias whispered, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the vacuum of the basin. Silas didn't look up from the stove. "Hear what?" "Exactly," Elias replied. Then came the rustling. It didn't sound like wind in the leaves or a small animal scurrying through the brush. It was a rhythmic, wet sound, the sliding of something heavy and soft across the dry pine needles. It circled the perimeter of their camp, just beyond the reach of the firelight. Every time Elias turned his head toward the noise, it stopped instantly, as if the thing in the dark were perfectly synchronized with his own heartbeat. Silas finally looked up, his eyes reflecting the dying embers, his expression suddenly unreadable. "Don't look into the trees, Elias. Whatever you do, keep your eyes on the flame." The fire crackled, a lonely spark in a sea of ink. Elias tried to focus on the flames, but the rustling didn't stop. It grew heavier, moving with a staggering, uneven gait that suggested far too many limbs. Then the silence was shattered not by a beast, but by a voice. "Elias, help me. I've twisted my ankle." Elias bolted upright, his heart hammering against his ribs. The voice was unmistakable. It was his own, the exact pitch, the same slight tremor he had when he was anxious. But he was sitting right there, and his mouth hadn't moved. "Don't move," Silas hissed, his hand gripping Elias's forearm with bruising force. Silas's face was pale, his eyes fixed on the tree line where the shadows seemed to be curdling. From the darkness, a scream tore through the basin. It started as a woman's high-pitched plea, transitioned into a guttural roar of a bear, and ended in a wet, clicking sound that set Elias's teeth on edge. It wasn't just loud, it felt layered, as if a dozen different throats were screaming at once. Something pale and elongated flickered past the edge of the firelight, a limb that looked like a human arm, but was twice as long, with too many joints bending in ways that defied physics. It didn't retreat. It began to drum against the trunk of a nearby cedar, a frantic, rhythmic pounding that sounded like a funeral march played on bone. The drumming on the cedar stopped as abruptly as it had begun, replaced by a wet, slithering sound that seemed to come from the canopy above. Elias looked up, his flashlight beam cutting through the dark like a blade. High in the boughs, he saw it, a shape that defied every law of nature he knew. It wasn't a single animal, but a shifting mass of pale, translucent flesh that looked like it had been stitched together from a dozen different nightmares. It had the torso of something vaguely canine, but its limbs were long, spindly things that ended in human-like hands, each finger twitching independently. Its head, if it could be called that, was a cluster of eyeless, weeping sores that pulsed with a faint, sickly bioluminescence. "What is that?" Elias choked out, his voice a mere rasp. Silas didn't answer. He was staring at the creature with a look of profound, paralyzed terror. The thing began to descend the tree, not by climbing, but by flowing down the trunk, its many-jointed limbs snapping and popping with every movement. As it reached the ground, it let out a sound that wasn't a scream or a roar, but a perfect, chilling imitation of Elias's own mother calling his name from a great distance. The creature's body began to ripple and fold in on itself, its shape changing with every step it took toward the fire. One moment it was tall and thin, the next it was a low, multi-legged carpet of twitching muscle. It was an impossible geometry of meat and bone, a creature that couldn't exist in the physical world. The creature didn't stop at the edge of the light. It began to unspool, its limbs stretching out like pale, rubbery ribbons to test the heat of the embers. As it entered the full glow of the fire, the true obscenity of its form became clear. It had no skin, only a thin, translucent membrane through which Elias could see organs that didn't resemble anything mammalian, pulsing black sacs and iridescent tubes that hummed with a low-frequency vibration. "Back away," Silas croaked, but his legs refused to move. The creature's face suddenly split open. It wasn't a mouth that appeared, but a vertical seam that ran the length of its torso, lined with hundreds of needle-like cilia that vibrated to produce the screaming sounds they had heard earlier. From this cavity, a long, multi-jointed appendage tipped with a human-like eye emerged, swiveling frantically to take in the camp. With a sound like wet Velcro being torn apart, the creature lunged. It didn't strike Silas, it enveloped him. The pale, multi-jointed limbs wrapped around the older man with impossible speed, the translucent membrane beginning to fuse with Silas's outdoor gear, then his skin. Silas didn't scream, not with his own voice. Instead, his mouth opened, and the creature's cilia vibrated to emit a perfect, joyful laugh that Elias recognized as his own from a childhood home movie. Elias watched in frozen horror as Silas's features began to soften and run like melting wax, his very biomass being harvested and reshaped into the creature's chaotic geometry. The thing was growing, adding Silas's nas to its own, its many hands now twitching in a synchronized, horrific dance. The thing that was once Silas, and now something far more, slid toward Elias with a sickening liquid grace. It didn't crawl, it seemed to fold the space between them, its many jointed limbs clicking like 1,000 knitting needles. As it loomed over him, the creature's mass began to settle, its chaotic geometry calming into a singular, horrifyingly familiar shape. The translucent membrane over his chest thickened and opaqued, forming the fabric of a thermal jacket. The weeping sores on his head retreated, replaced by a mess of dark hair. Below that, a face began to knit itself together, Elias's own eyes, his own nose, and finally, his own terrified mouth. Elias tried to scream, but no sound came out. He felt a sudden cold vacuum in his chest, as if his very identity were being siphoned through a straw. The creature, his twin in every horrific detail, tilted its head and reached out a pale, elongated hand. "Don't worry, Elias," the creature said, its voice no longer a mimicry, but a perfect, resonant match. "I'll take it from here. You look so tired of being you." With a sudden, violent snap of its many hidden joints, the creature lunged one last time. The campfire flickered and died as the two shapes merged into a single thrashing shadow. When the sun finally crested the peaks of Deadman's Pass the next morning, only one hiker stepped out from under the limestone overhang. He moved with a slight, stiff hitch in his gait, and his eyes remained fixed on the ground, but he hummed a quiet, happy tune in a voice that was perfectly, undeniably human.